That was the only
come up with hope.
Okay.
Other than that, no, it's going great.
Maybe I'm gonna run to the restroom.
Everybody is at State College except for a lady who's supposed to work her
So she is out there.
latest.
Yes, the hottest season is coming.
Just a heads up, we've started streaming, so whatever you say.
All right. So when do we want to go?
We'll do about 12:30.
Can you start giving me high signs at about 12:20?
Yep, we got it. Yeah, so that gives you 45 minutes from this second.
Yeah, we're going to review.
Do you want me to call back?
Yeah, we're going to review the 7th century and then talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Hey everybody, let's come on back to a seat. We're going to get started here. All right, and we are almost live. And we're live.
Okay, so we are back, and what we're going to do now is we're going to step away from, if you will, kind of the religious and doctrinal aspects of what we've been talking about, and we're going to run through the 7th century, okay? So that's the 600s. One of the things I think we've said a few times is that nothing happens in a vacuum, all right? So I had a young lady come up to me at the break and ask me, so how did we go from Pope Gregory, how did he actually become the Pope? Right? I mean, how did he go from who he was to actually becoming sort of the supreme pontiff? And the answer is he really didn't. I mean, when he stepped onto the scene, he wasn't imagining himself as the universal head of the church. Gregory was a man who answered a very specific political and religious need at the moment. As we talk through the 7th century, I think you're going to get a little bit of a sense of what was going on in the world. The 7th century sees a number of extraordinary events that have lasting impact on the history of Europe and on the social structures of Europe and especially on the church, the Romish church, the church that would later be in Europe. So what you first need to understand is that in 600, smallpox comes from India and is in Europe for the first time. All right? This is before vaccinations, before public health, before septic systems, before Pasteur. Okay, so when a disease of that virility sweeps across a continent, problems, right? Huge deaths. All right. This is not the plague, by the way, but it's something similar. And so the world's population shrinks down to 6. Boniface sets up what's later called the Holy See of the Apostle of Peter and becomes kind of the universal bishop in the Byzantine Empire. We'll talk more about what that means in a minute. In 610 was the Eastern Roman palace. All right, so remember the Roman Empire, as we would think of it, was in 2 places, Rome and then Constantinople. And when Heraclius comes and basically takes over, all right, so think about this for a minute. Up until this point, now when Heraclius comes in, he says, we're going to make the official language of the Eastern Empire Greek. Why that becomes even more important. Okay? In 615, a group of people, and these names are not significant, the events are, something called the Sassanid Empire sacks Jerusalem and makes off with holy relics. All right? So in just the first 15 years of the 6th century, there's been a huge, from their perspective, global pandemic of smallpox. There's been a change in the papacy in the Greek church. There's been a change of language in the Eastern and Roman empires. And then Jerusalem has been sacked by pagans.
Wow.
All of this is going on just as Gregory is kind of taking over, right? In the first 15 to 20 years, all these world events are going on. 622, why is that an important date in history? 622. Someone should know. 622. Year 1 of the Islamic calendar.
Wow.
Muhammad and his followers emigrate from Mecca to Medina in September of 622. So let's stop for a minute, okay? You've had this previously almost entirely Christian empire that now has two really competing centers. Constantinople, speaking a different language from Rome, disease, illness, and now the looming threat of a pagan enemy coming up from the Middle East and beginning to threaten the church in your half of the empire. You're getting the idea of the kind of sentiments. That's what we were just talking about, right? That all of this is going on. 629, the Byzantine-Arab Wars begin. And a lot of the Roman Empire is conquered by Muslim Arabs. 632, the Muslim conquests sort of begin in earnest. In 638, again, you don't need to know the dates. I'm just giving you kind of a sense of how quickly things are changing, right? If I was born in 600, I'm not even my age yet, and all these things that we're talking about have already happened. A lot of change in a lifetime. I mean, when you think about it in terms of one of our lifetimes, I mean, if Ed had been born in 600, all of these things would have happened before he is the ripe young age of, is it 50 this year, isn't it, Ed?
Still 49.
Still 49, me too. There's no 5 in front of it yet. I wanted to get that on tape. So, in 638, the Muslims conquer Palestine. So now, if you're a Christian, and infidels, non-Christians, have sacked your holy place, you're feeling some things
Yeah.
about that. Think back to Gregory as the new sort of political, spiritual leader of this side of the empire, as he looks across the water, so to speak, at his colleagues and goes, different language, beginning to have different beliefs and practices. Now their faith is threatened. These guys let the Holy Land get... I mean, you can see where this would go. So if you're him, there's a lot of things happening actually in Asia and India also at this time that don't have as much bearing on what we're talking about. But in 656, the first Islamic civil war happens. So now, what's going on? In 664, here's one that will mean something to us. The city of Kabul is conquered by the Muslims, and to this day.
Wow.
And then in 670, an Arab Muslim army moves across northern Africa and heads for Carthage.
Wow.
Okay? So think about this geographically. I've got a map here. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Oh, sorry, it's on the wrong one. But this, I should have probably put this map in. This will help you. Okay? Imagine, I hope I don't step outside of our thing here. I'm trying not to. Tell me, Matt, if I
You're
get...
good.
But imagine, okay, if you're in Rome, okay, and you're Gregory, and your compatriots in Constantinople, if the Muslims are coming up and around and they're going through your holy places and they're moving across Asia Minor into where the 7 churches were, they're coming across, they're coming around this way and they're coming around to the bottom and they're heading across towards Carthage. Imagine, excellent. So if you're here, right, and there's another significant religious center here, right on the other side of the empire, and the Muslims are coming from here, where are we here? Yeah. Mecca and Medina would be, sort of in here. Yeah. And they're coming through this way, heading this way, and they're coming down to Jerusalem. And all of a sudden, you're feeling pretty lonely here.
Yeah.
Okay? So imagine, and again, ignore that this is a different map, but just trying to give you a visual, right? So if you're Constantine, what are you thinking? Or I'm sorry, rather, if you're Gregory, what are you thinking? You're going, what in the world's going on with my world here a little bit, Here's another map that'll help us. The spread of Islam. Okay? Look at these dates. All right? 622 to 632. This little pocket down here. All right? 632 to 661. Look at the spread.
Wow.
Look at that spread. Tripoli. Carthage would be here. Gone. All right? And then the other caliphs later on stretching. And so by 750, man, you're talking, what in the world? And then they're already making journeys, military campaigns, battering away at the Eastern Church.
Wow.
At the Eastern Church. This is incredible stuff. And so Gregory, and so not just Gregory, but everybody on that side, they're feeling the pressure that some of the most vitriolic language against various excesses was issued. All right, they were thought leaders. All right, and so they would oftentimes raise the storm of public agitation. They were muckrakers. They would sometimes stir up the pot. And they would rush passionately into various theological controversies of their day and take sides and sort of inflame issues. Again, these are assertions that were made about them. And while they're generally on the side of orthodoxy, that wasn't always true. That wasn't always true. For some, these theological compromises created a lot of disunity, as you see on the slide behind you, and a man-centered faith. Again, take the rule of Benedict and roll that out into a very, very strict series of doctrines and practices and do's and don'ts ruling your life, your work, your thoughts, your time, your diet. There begins to become this very, very regimented, man-centered aspect to monasticism, or can be. Can be. A focus at times on external versus internal righteousness, right?
Yeah.
And sort of the best tradition of legalism. And I think as we talk about things like spiritual disciplines and the importance of a lived out faith, we need to be aware of these traditions ourselves, and we need to make sure that we don't place too much emphasis on the good that we can do. I actually think in our fellowship we've probably swung the other way. That pendulum has definitely swung the other way. For some people, monasticism was a simple way of expressing salvation in the gospel. For other people, it became sort of the overly focused on meritorious works as a way to obtain salvation. One of the other assertions about monasticism is, again, if you think back to Benedict, and you think back to Gregory, who came out of the Benedictine tradition, the perpetuation of false teachings about Mary, relics, superstitions, and other practices. Am I in the center of the camera there?
You're fine. You're
Good.
great. Yeah. We're just checking a setting.
And so because monasticism sort of in some sense owned institutionalized learning, it had an enormous amount of influence on doctrine, life, and practice. Anything that was good there spread. Anything that was bad there also spread.
Got it.
Okay? And the other allegation was that it created different classes of Christians. And sort of the leaders and the super spiritual and the super educated, and then kind of everybody else. You know? Monasticism generally, not universally, but generally did favor the idolatrous veneration of Mary, for example, and of the saints, and the images of worship, of worshiping of images and relics, and all kinds of other interesting doctrines that we don't have time to get into, but we can touch on very, very later when Anselm and Aquinas come after some of these things and challenge some of these things. We'll talk about them. And I think that the other thing that comes out of monasticism is a wide range of absurd fables, stories, myths, and legends about the alleged miracles and exploits and also sort of abuses of the monks, right? That there's lots of great folklore on those. And you can read, all you have to do is read medieval literature, all right? All you have to read is the Canterbury Tales, right? You read Chaucer, right? to see, you know, how these things sort of go, okay? And so great geniuses. Shakespeare loved to talk about these things, as did, of course, Chaucer and others. Generally, here are some of the positives that kind of came out of monasticism. Again, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. But it promoted anti-heathen options in society. And what I mean by that is, you know, were in many ways a prolific seminary for the clergy, right? Some of the most eminent thinkers and eminent theologians and most prominent folks in the church came out of monasticism. Most of the great leaders of the scholastic age, and many of the great thinkers and writers were educated, all right? Anthony, Bernard, Chrysostom, Jerome earlier before them, all right? Gregory the First that we talked about was an abbot, and Gregory the Seventh, whom we won't talk about, but it produced significant, powerful thinkers, and these folks influenced paganism. They gave people another option besides just living as they would, and so in some sense functioned in the highest tradition of apostolic Christianity, right? Being a living influence and an educating influence on a world that otherwise didn't have great teaching and didn't have great options. They created seminaries and clergy and other structures for the church, some of which are helpful and great, some of which obviously have been perverted. Of significant importance is this idea of schools and learning centers and the later cloister schools. It's difficult to imagine European culture and European Christian culture without the learning and without the schools and without the reading and writing and arithmetic and the other things that were taught in these cloistered and cathedral schools. Monasticism ultimately generated entire centers of learning, right? Very, very famous places. Can anyone think of a famous place that's now a college or university, globally famous, that used to be a monastery? Oxford in England is a notable example. Can anyone think of any others? I can't off the top of my head, actually, but I'm sure there are others. I'm not sure about Cambridge, but Oxford certainly, right, would be one such place. Okay? And so, again, further down the road, when we end up with the Jesuits and other orders that practice learning, all these things come. They have their roots in monasticism, all right? Boston College, the Boston College Eagles, might not exist were it not for monasticism. That's right. Who knew? That's right. Virginia Tech, the Hokies would exist, and the BU Terriers would almost certainly exist. I heard a woo back there. Come on.
But should they?
But should they? That's the question.
Oh, man.
But because of these centuries of learning, the other thing that came out of here is the great texts and Bible transcriptions and translations.
Amen.
Yeah.
Without which, where would we be?
Yeah.
Where would we be? So in many ways,
Well, and also because they happened to take to the deserts, all these early manuscripts ended up being preserved by the very fact that they ended up in these arid
right.
places.
That's right. Think about these communities that were reclusive. Some of the places to which they recluded, right? Like Ed says, were dry, arid places, and so you find the Qumran caves, for example, and other places where these things are remarkably
Inadequate.
right preserved for centuries. And so the fact that they withdrew, maybe not in all ways was in the best spirit of evangelism, but it did protect the text. It did protect the texts. And some of the great Bible translations of early centuries come from these monastic communities. And so they, because of that and their lifestyle, they were seen in some sense as protectors and defenders of the faith. These are all positive things. Early farming techniques, hymnody, music, right? So a lot of the great hymns, early hymns. Mm-hmm. But again, these were communities where agriculture, was prominent, and a lot of the things that they did became of vital importance, for Europe for centuries. So I think when we think of monk or we think of monastic, I mean, it's easy to think of excesses and abuses, but I think to be fair, and I think Noel actually says this in Turning Points, to be fair, I think the benefits of monasticism at least equal, if not outweigh, its abuses, at least on this side of the 20th century. So an important time for theological discussion, an important time to kind of hold on to the great institutions of the church. But the second thing that came out of this period of time was the coronation of Charlemagne. Now this is a bit later. And so what I want to do here for a minute is talk a little bit about politics and kind of world history. If you remember back to our map of a few minutes ago, right, that the world that we've been talking about, this world that kind of existed up through and right immediately prior to Constantine. All right, so Charlemagne. So there are threats, real threats going on in the world that he inhabits. And so probably the best place to start, how many of you guys have heard of the donation of Pepin? Anybody read about that in the church history book? Pepin was mayor of the palace. And was elected the French king. I think the date I've got here is 751. I think that's right. And so what happens when he's kind of elected is this idea of a king and a Christian kind of in the same body. The later alliances between Pepin and Stephen and other people whose names are probably not significant for the discussion. But what happened was when Pepin actually gave a large land grant, all right, to the Lombard kingdom, which is Italy. And essentially, I don't think I have the map here, but if you look at Italy, the donation of Pepin, again, the timing, the dates are, ignore the dates, but the donation of Pepin would have been a large piece of land, a land grant here in Italy. Well, the reason that that's significant is because after the donation of Pepin, the church owned the landmass all the way across here between these two ports, and Rome was essentially surrounded at that point by property that was owned by the church. That creates all kinds of taxation, financial, trade, all kinds of other things, and we won't get into all the details, but it creates a situation where there's an awful lot of power. Charlemagne, the connection here is that Pepin had granted these lands and had increased, in some sense, his family status and his family influence. His son was Charlemagne, King Charles. So Charlemagne is actually the son of Pepin. What I want you to take away from this is, again, you've got a highly political and powerful individual closely associated with the church in Rome, giving them money, giving them power, giving them influence, and then having the ability to suggest that his son be king. Wow. And be crowned, in some sense, Holy Roman Emperor. And so what you've got here, this is 800 AD, all right? So again, we've skipped forward, from the time of the Crusades, about 150, 160 years. And so the political situation now, when they crown Charlemagne, they actually do so on Christmas Day, as it turns out, in 800. And this event has, and you can read all about this, and I think Noel does a really good treatment with this. It's a fairly extensive treatment of this. But Constantine, is in reaction to several things. On the left-hand side of the column here, this is what's going on, all right? And we just described some of these things, all right? The increasing power of Islam, very, very, very significant. Threats, and they're beginning to feel the pressure that we just discussed. The political and theological strain between East and West, which we also discussed. Remember, because of language, increasingly because of doctrine, and also because now the threat of the Islamic threat moving up the coast, right? The Islamic threat coming up towards Constantinople, that's putting pressure on the situation as well. The papal lands and the power that came with those because of the donation of Pepin. Pepin had earlier been crowned the divine king and sort of established this idea that a worldly king could also sort of, in some sense, control the church. All right? So it was more of an early practice. The personal gifts and abilities. When I say gifts, I mean more the character, his ability to speak, his intelligence. He was a great theologian, a great speaker. He was powerful and influential, and he had a number of significant military conquests under his belt. And so again, think back in terms of why are we choosing this man to be our spiritual leader? What was the criteria that they were using? Connections, wealth, family, and natural and military abilities. How does the Bible instruct us to teach or to select leaders? How are we to do that? Does anyone have a scripture?
Yeah. 1 Timothy 3.
Yeah, let's look at 1 Timothy 3, exactly. 1 Timothy 3. So think about this, okay? Think about this. 1 Timothy chapter 3. Unbelievable. Verse 1. Here is a trustworthy saying. If anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. Now the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well. This is why Charlemagne was crowned, right? Not this.
Right.
Yeah.
Good point.
That is why, right? Efficacy, need, urgency, politics, right? We need a head of the church that can take us into battle. We need a head of the church that can protect our personal, political, financial freedoms, not our spiritual ones. Sorry, the evangelist in me there just sprung to life.
Keep going.
Let's go, Brett.
Unfortunately, the church married the king for power and protection, right-hand side of the slide.
Wow.
The church needed new influence and needed protection from the Islamic military and the idealism that was on that side. And in many ways, Charlemagne kind of models his empire on Augustine's city of God, and the church and the society, and the society at large essentially become one large entity. And the king has full support of the papacy. That these, really from this point forward, one could argue earlier, but from this point forward, the papacy, the church, and the state are wedded.
Wow.
For centuries. For centuries. And the center of the church moves from the Middle East. Why? Because it's been sacked.
Right.
The center of the church is the center of political power, the center of culture, the center of learning, and that the very character of the church changes immeasurably because of this period of time. And that what had just been sort of a drift and sort of slow attrition because of wars is now kind of finished. This is just a little bit about how it happened. Yeah, those are the specifics. I don't think we need to talk too much about that. I do want to talk for, it's 12:20. Is this a good stopping point?
Good
Like this is a
yeah.
good stopping point. Yeah, let's go ahead and make that the stopping point then. We'll come back and we'll talk about the Crusades on a nice full stomach.
Come on. All right, so well, you all know that there's plenty of places to eat nearby. We're going to actually get back here at 2, so we'll get an hour and 45 minutes. All right. All right.
Are you okay? Do you need to work and stuff very much? Or are you
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
I'm gonna plug this in, but that's about it.
Okay.
Huh?
Yeah.
Well, it's the old Squarespace, so it's not as cool. I know, it's sort of fun. I can go in and out of that one like it's nothing.
How are you, man?
What was that on? What? Is that on YouTube?
Okay. What time are you teaching?
Oh.
After Ed's Age of Reason tomorrow. Oh, and what Commonwealth Academy? Wrong one.
Wrong plug.
I love you.
Yes.
I mean, I forgive you. I know. No, I think this is
What is?
I do it to my mom.
Yeah, that's gotta
Look at that. Get yours back.
Try to put something in his face. He's like, he's not like violent about it.
What we're talking about in the Crusades really is.
Look away. It's like demons of maggots. I need my coat too. And I'm not taking the coat with me. I'm taking my feet. Good idea. I don't know where we want to go.
Documents written by
Because I have a login.
Wherever it is that we're going. I don't know where we're going.
Good, thanks.
Something that's in a warmer atmosphere. I'm even cold, and you know there's something wrong when I'm even cold. Because I live in the ice box.
Yo, Charlemagne, like, why is this not a TV show? Like, this sounds so down, struggle for power. I mean, this Game of Thrones will upload.
Alright.
Alright, where are we going?
Stuff is... No, I'm done with it.
I am.
won't really mention everything to you.
So we're going at 2?